Great, thank you, Meredith. This year's winner, Imbi Neeme, was the recipient of the 2019 Henry Handel Richardson Fellowship at Verona, and her short fiction and blogging has won several awards. The Spill, her first novel, is a compelling story depicting the lives of two sisters over 4 decades, bookended by a fateful accident when they were children and the recent death of their mother. Imbi, congratulations on your very new win and very new publication. What is it like to be a prize-winning debut author over 50, and what does this award mean for you? And how often do you get to wear your crown and wave your sceptre around?
Well, first, Cass, I just want to say I'm still a couple of months away from my 50th birthday. So I'm still...
no, that is not fair. You told me to ask what it was like to be an over 50 author.
Near her 50s, I think I said, maybe. But anyway, let's pretend for the sake of argument that I am 50 and fabulous for it. No, it's a couple of months away, so I may as well be 50. I was already in gestation at 50 years ago, so that's fine. You and I are good. In answer to your question, it feels great. Like, it feels amazing. We're talking a 45-year journey. When I was 5, I just remember writing my first book, which I'm going to pitch to Penguin shortly, about a rocket ship and a turkey coming out and there being a party. But I just remember being so proud of myself, and it was published in my school's magazine, and just I just remember so clearly how excited I was, and I've held on to that feeling, and I think I just knew I was going to be a writer. I just didn't know it was going to take me so long, but here I am, and here
you are, and you've got the same feeling now, I can tell.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And my apologies, you don't look a day over 25, and that was a complete misunderstanding on my account, so let's just get that out of the way. Thank you, Imbi. Now, Kathryn Hind has also published many short stories and essays, and was the first Penguin Literary Prize winner for her manuscript Hitch, which is about a young woman hitchhiking across Australia with her dog to escape her past, and that was published last year. Kathryn, what have the last 12 months been like for you, and what has winning this award meant for your writing and for your confidence?
Oh, hi everyone. Imbi, it's so great to hear your delight and your enthusiasm. And I was just thinking back to when Meredith told me over the phone that I'd won the prize, and I was so cynical, wasn't I, Meredith? I was like, well, what am I going to do with it?
Took her a while to show her enthusiasm. I was a bit nervous.
I don't know why I was so on guard. I guess 7 years of rejection might do that to you, but there it is. But yeah, so it's been a year since Hitch was released, and just writing the second novel now is just a totally different experience. There are still no guarantees with the second novel, but there's a quiet confidence in my abilities, and a kind of courage, I guess, in just trying whatever it is that I feel an impulse to try. And it's quite freeing. As much as I love Hitch, it's a book that took me 7 years, that had a lot of challenges and restrictions in its perspective and what I felt I could say. And I'm writing a totally different story now, that with a character who's much more open, and it's a real delight to explore her like that. So it's been a life-changing event getting my first book published, and the last year has been a mixture of getting used to having a book in the world and also getting used to starting again with the second one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kathryn. You've got all that ahead of you, Imbi. That's all to come, through all the ups and downs. I wanted to start, Imbi, by talking to you about one of the strongest themes of The Spill, which is the contradiction of experience versus memory, and how our recollections of past events can colour our relationships for many years, even if those memories are incorrect or if we've misunderstood the context. Can you talk to us a little bit about the sisters, Nicole and Samantha, and how their childhood, their car accident shaped their lives as they grew into adulthood.
Yeah, I think that gap between experience and memory has always been very interesting to me. And there was a friend, or there is a friend, who had this argument with her sister about their childhood, and they both had such completely different accounts of the same event. They could have been two separate events, you know, but they happened at the same time. They were there at the same place. So I was like, how does that happen? How does that happen that, you know, obviously I experience things differently from my sisters, but then as the years go by, those things get twisted and bent out of shape. And for Nicole and Samantha, even in that very first chapter, we see the difference between their two sisters. There's a status thing there. One gets a lollipop, the other one's quite jealous and gets the lollipop off the other sister. There's already, you know, some status play there. But after the incident, there's a question about whether or not the mother Tina was drinking at the time, and they both make a decision about what they choose to believe about that. And that slowly, that one thing slowly becomes a big thing, a big rift between them, plus other many, many layers of miscommunication and misunderstanding.
I think that's something that will really resonate with readers, is that that universal thing of you and your siblings remembering the same incident differently. I mean, there's many, many arguments at the Christmas table, I'm sure, about that. Now, the structure of the spill is quite complex. What were you thinking, Imbi? Really, what were you thinking? We go, for people who haven't read it, we go backwards and forwards from the present day to isolated incidents in years past. We go to 1982, then to 2013, then to 1990, then to 2006, in between the present also. And that could have been quite confusing. That had the potential to be quite confusing. But I actually really admired the way that you pieced together the puzzle of these characters' lives, and you seamlessly moved between time periods with short, sharp chapters that enabled me as a reader to really stay with you every step of the way. I did not feel confused at all. Why did you choose that complicated structure, and what were some of the challenges in writing that way?
Well, I think, for one thing, my experience of my own memory, I'm not going to speak for other people. I think of my memory as being a bit like my underwear drawer, where all the socks have gotten separated and the bras all tangled up in the undies. It's sort of not organised. And so this idea of storytelling tends to be linear, but the human mind is not linear. So I wanted to explore that a bit further, and I came up with this idea of the sort of jigsaw puzzle sort of structure, where I'm kind of handing pieces from different parts of the puzzle to the reader one at a time, and they're slowly able to build a larger picture. And I think, you know, there are some memories in my mind which have much greater weight than others, but others can still have been very significant. So yeah, it was a really big challenge. It was an experiment, a bold experiment that needed a very complex spreadsheet to manage it. But I did do a spreadsheet so that I could look at the book in its chronological sort of, you know, happenings. From when the girls were young to the present day, and also look at it in the order that it appears in the novel, and make sure that every chapter was earning its place, was working hard enough to deserve to be there.
Well, I think you did it really well. So congratulations for that.
Oh.
Okay, you passed. Meredith, what do you think that structure adds to the story, and what attracted you as a publisher to that form or that structure?
I think it adds a lot, actually, although one of the things that I think is incredibly clever about the spill is that people can read it without realising the level of complexity in the construction of it. And it just adds all those different kind of emotional layers as well. I have 3 sisters. I know Imbi has sisters. I know Kathryn has a sister, and life with sisters is complex and interesting and emotional and wonderful, and I can't imagine not having any. but I did really admire the cleverness. But of course, we were working to ensure that it could be it could be read without looking too clever all the time. Not that we wanted to dumb it down, but we didn't want readers to get caught up in these pieces and how the pieces fit together in terms of the chapters. We did want them to know to follow the pieces of the story. And it did, I challenged Imbi on a few of them. Is that the right place for that piece? There was a bit of back and forward in that way, but an author with a spreadsheet, it's hard to refute what's going on there. But I really enjoyed as a reader that additional layer to the story, even though there's so many novels about sisters out there, and I'm sure some people go, oh, another story about sisters, but putting it together and pulling it apart, because the novel is both put together and pulled apart numerous times along the way, I do think added a lovely extra layer of thinking for the reader.
Yeah, the structure of it is definitely one of the things that makes it stand out, I think. Very interesting structure. Kathryn, just going to you, Hitch is an entirely different structure. It's a straight linear narrative that almost sort of meanders along slowly as we accompany Amelia on her hitchhiking journey. Sometimes not much happens, but it's that menacing, ever-present threat that something terrible might happen that keeps us in this constant state of anxiety. Amelia's running from her past, and I'll ask you to talk about that in a moment. But just in terms of sticking with the structure of the story, you managed to keep our interest even while we're navigating those long days that almost run together into sameness. And I think that the way that you do that is through the strength of your characters. So I wanted to ask you about the importance of characterization in your writing, and also the sense of place and the small details that you use that kept propelling the story forward.
Yeah, okay. Well, character is everything, whether that's character of a person, character of a place, the character of a specific detail. So I was using that kind of character to choose the details that I shared, and to reflect the kind of person that Amelia is, because she is not willing to divulge much. She's trying not to remember. She's trying not to feel her emotions. She's really trying to avoid her own pain. So the world around her and the things she sees and the characters she meets are all used to tell us something about her character. So yeah, it was definitely the biggest challenge of the book, was to reveal a character who doesn't want to be revealed, and to make people empathize with someone who doesn't have that much empathy for herself. Yeah, so that was definitely a huge challenge.
And again, really well executed, really, really beautiful writing. So congratulations. Meredith, what was it about Hitch that drew you initially to the story?
The extraordinary tension that you mentioned, and again, all those tiny, tiny details that just continue to build and build and build, and the variety of interactions along the way between characters and dogs, but in exchanges in rear vision mirrors, just as characters pass, as they enter or exit a pharmacy, just the tiniest little details just built and built and built. I just found it an incredibly emotional novel, and one that people who are enduring different things, running from different things. I don't really think of Hitch as a novel about running from things. I just think of it as a forward propelled novel. What lies ahead? What is she going to? What is she going to find? And I just felt like there was something in that for so many readers. Yeah, I just that overwhelming containment of the novel was so powerful. And
the tension, I just found it exhausting. I found it completely exhausting in a good way. So both of these books are set after the recent deaths of the protagonists' mothers. So I wanted to ask each of you, Imbi and Kathryn, if you could talk a bit about grief. Kathryn, perhaps about the delayed impact of grief, and Imbi maybe about the way that grief shifts the dynamics for those who are left behind.
Kathryn should go first.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny because I started writing about grief in Hitch when I was observing someone else's grief, which sounds really ruthless of me, and since have more experience with my own grief. So it's kind of interesting to feel like I actually got it right with Amelia, having not suffered that kind of grief yet. But I think for Amelia, there is a delay in her grief. I think that sometimes when people experience hardship, they're sometimes not equipped to deal with it at that particular moment, and it can settle within someone's psyche until they have the strength to face it, or until it becomes so strong that it bursts out. So I think that that's the case with Amelia, that it's the death of her mother is too much for her to handle in one go, and her journey through Australia is her slowly building up the strength to come to terms with it, and to start to picture a life without her, and to also face the other traumas that she's left to face alone without having ever told her mother. Yeah, and I just wanted to add a bit about structure and the exhausting nature of it, Cass. And I did realise that I was asking a lot of the reader with Hitch. There are no chapters, and there is no real break. And I wanted to simulate what it's like to be on the road, and to offer the reader a break didn't seem fair when Amelia wasn't getting a break herself. So I wanted that kind of under the skin feeling that she had, of there being nowhere to turn, nowhere to rest. But it's
that's a really valuable insight, actually. And I remember when I was reading it, realizing that there were no chapter breaks, but I'd kind of forgotten that. But yeah, I guess that adds to the whole, the relentlessness of it. Yeah. Imbi, did you want to talk a bit about grief in your story?
You said you were going to ask questions that no one else had asked me, and no one's actually asked me about grief so far. So you win the crown.
Yeah, grief.
So I think yes. So obviously, very early on we have the death of the mother, Tina, and you already see the difference between the two sisters. They're both grieving in very different ways. In fact, I think that's a line in the book is, we all grieve in different ways, and people think that that's coming from the same funeral parlour brochure, because it's a very much a cliche, but it's one that rings true. We have different ways of processing. There's some resentment there between the sisters, because one ostensibly didn't visit the mother in hospital, and so Nicole, the older sister, feels like she has carried the burden of her mother's illness and her mother's passing, and also the kind of the aftermath, because the thing about death, it's final for the person who has passed away, but there's all this kind of administration that needs to happen afterwards, which is, like incredibly unfair to ask people who are freshly grieving to kind of have to clear out houses and clear out, lives. So I kind of wanted, I sort of explore sort of some of those different ways of grieving through those two sisters. They're my vehicle for that.
Thank you. Yeah, you do it well. Going back to Hitch, Kathryn, Amelia, as you mentioned, she's also facing the delayed impact of past trauma, and the novel explores the grey areas around consent, the subtle sexism that occurs so casually that it's hardly even notable or noted, and the balance of power and how that can be shifted. Obviously, we're not going to give any spoilers, but I think it's fair to say that Amelia is haunted by a previous relationship, and the power that that man still holds over her, even if it's only in her head. Could you talk to us a little bit about those issues?
Sure. I think the way that Amelia's experience in the past manifests is in a hypervigilance in the way that she travels and the way that she experiences being in proximity to other people, the way that she notices the tiniest details about people can seem a little, well, you could read it as the writing being overdone, but what it is a portrait of someone who's constantly on guard. And I think that what's happened to her in her past has made her that way. And people often don't know how to take Amelia. And I think the reader hopefully is challenged sometimes by her actions, and they may not make rational sense, but she's sometimes compelled towards danger. And I think that can happen to people who are in pain and who are suffering from traumatic memories. So I did want to explore that, the experience of a woman who feels that she constantly has to be on guard. And the way that it means she is also closing herself off from potentially safe, happy relationships, as well as potentially avoiding dangerous situations, and how that's limiting for her. So it's a really important part of Hitch.
Because she really doesn't know. It's very hard for her to tell, and it's hard for the reader to tell which of these people that she meets along the way, these strangers, who's going to be safe and who's potentially threatening. It's very hard for the reader as well as for Amelia to tell that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Imbi, in the spill, obviously it focuses on the relationship between two sisters. And as you mentioned earlier, even when they're young children, we can see how their interactions will determine the kind of adults that they will become. How much of the dynamics between siblings do you think are established in childhood? And is it possible, or how difficult is it to change those early roles as time passes?
Ooh, yeah, I think there is a certain amount of, relationships with siblings kind of set a bit like concrete in those sort of early years with those power structures. And it is hard to kind of break those, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think too that, a lot happens to us as children, and we have these moments, these defining moments, and for them it's the car accident, and then each chapter is kind of a small or large moment of where their lives kind of pivot a little bit. I've forgotten what I was saying, but anyway, it'll come back to me. But I think that we still have those moments as adults was what I was going to try and say before I forgot what I was going to say. And even as adults, we're still learning, and we're still, people who still have their minds open. I mean, some people do remain set like concrete, but I personally, I try to still learn about myself and concede that I'm not always right. I hope not. My husband's not listening to this, but I'm also not always right about the past. I think that's something that's really important about the spill, is that we all have these stories about family that we carry with us as being sort of truth. We carry the truth, but there's this whole other side to that story.
It's just our truth.
Yeah, it's our truth, or our version of the truth, something that we've kind of ended up telling ourselves. And I think that if I wanted anybody to get anything from the spill, it would be just reassessing some of those difficult characters in their family, or some of those sort of like family legends where so-and-so did such and such and that was terrible, but actually maybe it wasn't so terrible, and maybe we should stand in so-and-so's shoes for a while.
Yeah, good point. So as well as having grief in common with these books, both of the books explore themes of regret, self-worth and shame. And I wanted to ask both of you, how do your characters react to those feelings, and what allows them to change their perspectives during the course of the novels?
Kathryn, you go first again. You've got the speaking stick.
Thank you.
The scepter. You should have the scepter.
Yes.
The scepter.
Thank you. Regret, self-worth, and shame. Yeah. Well, self-worth is certainly something Amelia struggles with, and as a survivor of sexual abuse, I mean, this is a huge problem for her, to feel that she's worthy of joy, and worthy to take up space in the world. She's constantly aware of how much space she's taking up, whether that be in conversation or literal physical space. And I think that the Hitch is a story about her learning, at least in part, what she is worth, or the potential for herself if she is able to believe in herself. And the challenges she faces on the road are pieces of the puzzle in helping her to believe in herself. Regrets, yes, she definitely has regret. I personally don't mind spoilers, but I know other people have issues with them, so I'm trying to be thoughtful. She's kept her cards close to her chest. She hasn't confided in many people about the ways in which she's suffered, and her mother has died, so anything that she might have wanted to tell her mother, she no longer has the opportunity to do that. So that is a huge regret for Amelia, and it's something that she doesn't necessarily know she regrets at the beginning, because she doesn't realize that confiding in people can be worthwhile and kind of possibly cathartic for her. And shame, runs thick and fast through Hitch as well. Amelia is coming to terms with her shame. She wouldn't call it that, I don't think. I think that it's, once you're able to recognize it as shame, you're pretty far down the track of moving away from it, of separating from it. And she's got a long way to go with that. But I hope that there are, seeds of hope that she is working her way out of a place of shame that she absolutely doesn't deserve to be in.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. That sense of shame, it's not necessarily deserved. That's
right.
Yeah. Imbi?
Oh, Cass, you've asked me to remember 3 words. You've asked me a lot of me today. So
just pick one. Just pick any one.
Well, all 3 are, the novel is peppered with all 3 of those words and other words. But I think that sort of self-worth, I mean, certainly for Nicole, the older sister, she has a lot of trouble asserting her own desire. I think there's a point where she says it kind of sticks in her throat, like something she won't come out, but won't kind of go down. And her journey is a lot quieter than her sister's, Samantha, but I like to think that I often talk about the sisters as states of water, and I apologise to anyone who's heard me say this before, but Samantha is ice moving to a water state, and Nicole is steam also moving to a water state. So they end up, in the same place, having started at sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. And I feel that, Nicole, her sense of self-worth does kind of solidify. I think regret and shame are probably bigger themes with Samantha, the younger sister, who has lots of things that I think she describes, a couple of memories, things that are just too painful to think about. They're like glass pressed into flesh. And I know I carry some of those memories. There are things that are a bit like episodes of The British Office, which I cannot watch. The scenes that I have never been able to look at with my human eyes or listen to with my human ears. But I do have memories like that, which are just kind of like, so I like to think that by the end of the novel that she's kind of starting to take ownership. She blames everybody. She spends a lot of time blaming her mother, blaming her sister, blaming her father, her stepmothers. Like she she starts to take a bit of ownership for her part in her own story.
Yeah. Another thing that you have in common with both is that both books were inspired by true life events. So, Imbi, you were in a car accident when you were 10, and Kathryn, you have hitchhiked throughout Australia, America, and Iceland. How important were those formative experiences in authenticating your stories?
Me or you?
Oh, you go. I've started a few times. You go,
Okay.
Mindy.
All right, I've got the stick. I think, so yes, I was in a car accident, and I am legally obliged to say at this point and in every interview about the book, my mother was not drunk at the time. But my mother and sister and I, we did flip the car on the Hume Highway, and it was a really big moment for me. It really changed the course of my being, my personality. I became incredibly anxious after that and quite controlling. And even to this day, I need to know the plan. If I don't know the plan, God help us all. And if you change the plan, dear God, I'm coming after you. But I was really, again, those moments where a personality can kind of be formed or kind of pivoted or sort of, just flipped about like a car, became really interesting to me. And because that had been such a big moment for me, it seemed like the natural place to start, but I immediately started fictionalizing it. So it's, in Western Australia on a remote road. They've come from Esperance. Who knows where they're going? Well, you have to read the book to find that out, but it was very, very different. But I was glad to have that personal experience to draw on. And I always say that, tragedy plus time equals comedy, and I feel like life plus time equals fiction. I've got enough distance and perspective on that experience now to really be able to play around with it.
And Kathryn, in your book, we sense danger from the very first pages of Hitch because of the fact that Amelia is a young woman hitchhiking alone. Can you explain that hypervigilance that you mentioned earlier that necessarily accompanies a woman who's in that situation, and how does that affect how she moves through the world, how she reacts to new situations or to strangers, and how did you draw on your own experience when you were writing that?
Yeah, well, my experience of hitchhiking, for the most part was much more positive than Amelia's. And it was actually, the worst moments when I was traveling alone were actually times when I had let my guard down, when I thought, okay, I'm somewhere safe, and actually it turns out I wasn't. And that, it's hard to, I don't want to downplay what happened, men kind of breaking into my train compartment and this kind of thing, but I was totally fine. But the thing is that it made me realize that there is no moment that you can let your guard down. And when you're in the car of a stranger and you're just completely in their hands, and it did make me pay a lot of attention to the small details. And with many years have passed now, and I look back and I'm amazed at some of the things that I did and that I probably wouldn't do now. But I think that Amelia, as I mentioned, has this kind of compulsion to get close to danger, and she needs to test herself, even though she may not know why. And I think I was a bit like that when I was traveling alone. I didn't know that I felt I had something to prove, but I was really traveling on a mission, and I picked up heaps of experiences, and most of them were really positive. An Icelandic lady took me to her farmhouse and let me ride her Icelandic horses. That was a real highlight. But there's lots that was kind of too strange to put in fiction, but I certainly tried to include some of the strange characteristics that I came across in some of my characters. Yeah.
Thank you. Imbi, in the spill, Oh, there's so many questions I have, but I'm going to go with this one. I really love the way that you used a trail of breadcrumbs through the story. So you'd seed a sort of small, inconsequential detail in one chapter, and then it would reappear in a further chapter as being highly significant. I wanted to ask you, as a writer, did you do that consciously as you were writing, or did you go back during the editing process and add those breadcrumbs for the benefits of the reader?
I think, well, you know, we talked a lot about the structure before, and certainly the first draft was very difficult for people to read. And one of the things that I have really been so relieved about is how many people have said how readable the spill is, because I feel like that kind of means that all their hard work kind of paid off. But one of the things about that early draft was that there wasn't enough things tying or tethering each of those past chapters to the present sort of narrative. And the present narrative is sort of based on the hero's journey loosely. And I thought that would be enough to propel the readers forward, but not when they're kind of being flung back and forth in time, like they're on some kind of, you know, terrible ride. So I had to go through and make sure that, you know, when I was talking about every chapter earning its place, every chapter introduced or mentioned or resolved one of those micro mysteries, whether it's about a bunch of flowers or, you know, the wedding party at Samantha's wedding. So it was kind of, so there was a little bit of that to begin with, but then it was like I had to get my needle out and all my coloured threads and just find ways to weave it all together so that it held and held strong enough to carry the reader through. And hopefully I've succeeded. You
did succeed.
Yes. Hooray, hooray.
Yes, you get the crown. You get to wear the crown. You should put your crown on.
I put the crown on. Thank you.
So both of these novels explore the messiness of life. Nothing straightforward, memories unreliable, family or loved ones are not always what you need them to be. And even if that family member is dead, the reverberations of their presence are still really strongly felt. Particularly in the spill, Tina, you know, who is a very flawed character, I think is probably one of the most interesting characters in the book because she's so deeply flawed. Meredith, why do you think writing about families is so consuming and so interesting for readers?
Because families are so consuming and interesting, and the source of knowledge, the source of amusement, the source of sustenance, the source of challenges. People either come from a family or create their own family. Very few people exist entirely on their own. So we're all looking for those other worlds to make our family. And gosh, right now we've all created new little families, haven't we? You know, because we've all been a bit more isolated than usual. So I think the same, you know, we look to fiction all the time for stories to help explain our world or to offer us another world. And families just are. Ask Tolstoy, ask everyone, you know, families are endlessly fascinating and have been the source of fiction for a very long time.
Often more fascinating than fictional families, actually, real families.
Yeah, harder to believe than those that are in fiction. I mean, always that is something we all know. Every writer knows, every publisher knows that real life, sometimes you just can't get away with in fiction because it's too wacky.
I feel like both the novels are also saying something about choice. So the choices that we make, the choices we're pressured into making, the excuses we make to validate our choices, and how we deal with the consequences of our choices. Imbi or Kathryn, what interests you about the agency of characters and how that plays out?
I'll go. Yeah, I think that, you know, Hitch is a feminist book, and I wanted to explore the ways that Amelia is restricted in systems that some of which are obvious to her and some of which aren't. And she's pushing against that, whether she knows it or not, and she is seen as transgressive for traveling the way that she is, but for reasons that she comes to learn, she needs to do it. She needs to claim her space in the world, and she needs to see what she's made of, and she forges ahead with the little agency that she has, even though she's constantly told she should not be doing it, that it's no place for a woman, that she's asking for trouble. There's a chorus of voices that try and stop her in her tracks, and even punish her for daring to exploit her own agency in that way. So it's something that I really wanted to examine, and I wanted to see Amelia become more powerful within her agency, and to push herself to the boundaries of it, and see herself excel, and to fail as well. And I hope that the highs and the lows of Hitch come through, and that people are kind of barracking for Amelia, because she needs a sideline.
They definitely are. Yeah. Imbi, did you want to add anything?
I'm going to go rogue for a moment, Cass. I'm not going to answer your question, but I'm just going to I'm going to piggyback off something that Kathryn said, which she said that Hitch is a feminist novel, and I think, like The Spill, in its structure, I feel is a feminist novel. And actually my very dear friend Emily Collier, who's in there somewhere in the digital crowd, when she read it, she said it's a very feminist structure. And I just had this one, my 21-year-old self, who wrote a dissertation on feminist performance theory at UWA, was so thrilled when she said that. And of course, when I was 21, I was railing against the linear nature of story structure, because it sort of mirrored the male sexual experience, and the female experience is more circular and endless, and by sort of starting with the bit before the accident, and having the accident as the midpoint, and the end of the book being just before the accident, if I got that wrong. Anyway, the structure was this kind of series of sort of circling around, and I went, 21-year-old Imbi would be like right on, sister, with this book. So I just wanted to add that.
Great. You might be overthinking things there a little bit, but we'll let it pass.
We are
almost at the time for audience questions, I think, Chrissy. I have plenty more questions to ask, but we probably should leave.
We've got quite a time for questions, so we might try and knock off a couple of these just before we end. That's been a really fascinating discussion, by the way. I've been really enjoying it. There's a couple of questions here. So one of them here, give me a second, is from Carly Napier. A question for Imbi. In your acknowledgements, you mentioned the determination and perseverance you learned from your grandfather. What practices did you learn from him, and do you have any advice for other writers on how to cultivate the qualities?
Thank you, Carly, and hello, Carly. That's a good question, and I'm glad to speak about my grandfather, who was a visual artist, and who was not actually acknowledged. His work was not acknowledged in his home country in his lifetime. He actually received an award from the Estonian Prime Minister days after his death, and it would have been awarded while he was still alive, but we didn't get the news until after he had passed. And my grandfather worked tirelessly at his visual art, and he would work all day designing flexible packaging and in a sort of a company, and then we'd come home, eat dinner with the family, and go straight out to his studio, and he would paint until the early hours every single night. And though he never quite got the recognition in Australia or back home, where he dearly wanted that acknowledgement and that recognition, he still did it. He still showed up every night in his studio and did the thing that he loved. And I think that's where I got with my own writing. When I sort of initially started writing long form fiction, when I started my manuscripts, I would just like want to get published. And there was a moment of letting go for long, complicated reasons, but where I realized actually it's not about the acknowledgement, although that's nice and prizes are nice. It's about the doing. It's about the love of putting words on the page, of creating these amazing characters. I mean, I feel like every single character in the spiel is so real to me, and I made them. Like, I made them more than I made my kids, and that is incredibly satisfying. You feel like a god, and I think as long as even if I never get published again, as long as I still have that love of creating worlds and lives and relationships and all the wonderful human things, then I'll be okay. So that's what I learned.
Great. And there's a question here for Meredith from Bianca Milroy. She would like to know what the Penguin Literary Prize looks for. If not in a particular theme, then what qualities distinguish those books, and is there a difference between Australian literary fiction from commercial or genre fiction, for instance?
One of the things I should have said up front actually is that every year there are 5 judges each year, and each year 4 of them have been new. I've been the only consistent one. So it's not only me who is reading these manuscripts and making the final decision. And along the way, each year we've had a lot more entries than we expected. And the last year was almost 400. And we have a lot of volunteer readers across the Penguin Random House business. And in fact, even at UBD, the warehouse part of our business, because everyone who works in any part of the book business tends to be book lovers, and part of the reason they're there is to get that access to books and to read. So we had this year 49 different readers who were reading the manuscripts and helping the selection process. And there were 3 stages of reading to get to the shortlist. So the 6 manuscripts on the shortlist would have had 3 different readers before they landed with the 5 judges. So there is a lot of reading along the way and a lot of different people viewing them. And the guidelines they have are quite simply, we are looking for a manuscript that stands out above and beyond the others. And because the Imprints Prize goes into our more at the literary end, yes, we would be looking for things that are, I just find the classifications of literary fiction and commercial fiction so difficult to really define, but certainly genre fiction is not excluded in any way. But the judges who are reading are pulled much from the more literary end of the business.
Excellent. And a question here for Imbi and Kathryn. What piece of advice would you give to other writers in preparing their manuscripts for submission for an opportunity like the prize? What advice would you give someone if you're about to submit to the prize, Imbi and Kathryn?
Okay, I've got the stick. I would say be brave and try not to be a perfectionist. The best manuscript that you have time for by the due date is the one you should absolutely send in. And obviously do everything you can to get it to the place that you're happy with. But I think Meredith will agree that they're not looking for perfection. They're looking...
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. And so, yeah, just believe in the energy of your manuscript, and press send. Be brave.
Imbi?
Well, I agree with Kathryn that you want to get it as good as you can get it. And what I realised in this whole process is that I did get it as good as I could get it, and then it got a whole lot better with the help of Meredith and Genevieve Buzo, my wonderful editor. So, but the other thing too is that, look, so many times I wasn't the person who was chosen. I didn't get shortlisted or longlisted or, didn't win. but that doesn't say anything about the quality of your work. When you listen to Meredith talk about the pathway that these books took to get to being the winner, it's like so much of that is about whose desk it lands on at what time. And so there's an element of luck and so don't get discouraged. Just keep going, keep submitting, keep standing by your work, tell the stories you want to tell, and go for it.
That's fantastic. Look, really good advice, and possibly a great place to end on, I think, for the conversation tonight. Cass, you've done a fantastic job wrangling this panel yet again. So thank you from us at Avid and from the panellists for your job.
That's all right. Thank you. I just want to hold both of these wonderful books up here so you can see them. I can highly recommend both books. Character-driven stories about grief, past trauma and shame, but with each of them ending on a note of hopeful optimism. Congratulations to both of you, Kathryn, and especially you, Imbi, because your book baby is so new. And to all three of you tonight for your insightful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cass.
Thanks, Chrissy. And thank you, Avid
Chrissy.
Reader.
Lots of love to Avid Reader.
Thank you. It has been really fantastic to listen, and we look forward to coming back next year when we will get a Brisbane book. So that will be really fun. Now, I'm going to actually try and allow people to unmute themselves. There we go. So I've clicked allow people to unmute themselves so that we can all give everyone a round of applause, and then I will disconnect. So if you want to unmute yourself, everyone. And
Yay! Congratulations!
Oh, and a dog.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
See you later.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.